We are atop the Liberty House in the middle of Nairobi with a panoramic view as we asked ourselves what the role of the British was in the colonization of Africa. Of course, history tells us that the British started the exploration in the 16th century, but in the continent of Africa, the activities of the British that led to colonization started between 1880 and the year 1900 for reasons that have been characterized as follows. Number one, that they wanted to engage in commerce. Number two, because of strategic reasons. Number three, because of culture and religion. Number four, because of personal pride. But in their quest, between 1880 and the year 1900, the British had occupied several parts of Africa. They were in Sierra Leone, they were in the Gambia, they were in Nigeria, they were in Ghana, they were in Sudan, they were in what is now called Somaliland, they were in Uganda, they were in Kenya, and of course they were in what is present-day Zambia, present-day Zimbabwe, and present-day Malawi. But after the World War, we remember that they took over what is today the United Republic of Tanzania, which had been under the control of the Germans. The question is, how did the British govern their colonies? Unlike the French, the British had a very unique and interesting way of governing her colonies. It was called indirect rule. And what was indirect about it? It was indirect because the British came to whichever territory they wanted to occupy initially as protectorates. And protectorates were lands that had been claimed on behalf of their monarchs as areas where they could conduct their commerce. And in quite a number of countries, they remained protectorates until they were converted into colonies. Kenya, where we are at as we have this conversation, became a British settler colony uniquely because of its weather. They liked the weather in Kenya so much, and what they did was to take the fertile land and give it to the settlers while they put the indigenous people in the more marginal land. The same thing happened in what is present-day Zimbabwe, which was then known as Rhodesia. And the most critical thing is that the British would come into a space and they identify those who are the leaders. When they went to the Buganda kingdom, for example, they entered into a pact with the Kabaka of Buganda. They tried it amongst the Bunyoro Kitara. And if you did not succumb to their entreaties, they would exile you to the islands in St. Helena or the Seychelles. They would take you out of the territory. And primarily, as one would imagine, the major motivation was economic. This is a little island with very bad weather and friendly most of the time. They have appetite for coffee. They have appetite for tea. They have appetite for things that are going to help them to industrialize. They have appetite for sugar cane because they are making sugar. They have appetite for cotton because they have their textile industries in Manchester and different places. They have appetite for soda ash because they want to use it for making glass. They have appetite for iron ore. They have appetite for coal. They have appetite for all these minerals. And what they are trying to do, therefore, is to enter into commercial activities that are going to ensure that the activities at home are aided. And it's not lost on us that initially the interaction between the British and many of their colonies was through companies. The Imperial British East African Company, for example. And when they came into East Africa, you see that they were engaged in the construction of railways for purposes of going into the hinterland. and many of the railways were being built by the Indian coolies from their colony in India. And the whole idea was that when you built the railways like the East African, the Uganda Railway, which started from the coastline of Mombasa through to Uganda, was meant to bring coffee from Uganda and other goodies to the ports and then to the United Kingdom. And this continued in different parts of the continent of Africa. In East Africa, of course, coffee was a major commodity that was traded. Tea was a major commodity, as we have indicated. When they went to western part of Africa in countries such as Sierra Leone, countries such as Nigeria and Ghana, there of course was cocoa and gold. And today, if of course you go to the British Museum and in other places where they keep these artifacts, you'll find a lot of artifacts, because it was also cultural. You'll find a lot of cultural artifacts that was taken from the kingdoms of Benin. And this was to be found in countries such as Nigeria. The Gambia did not promise much, but was strategic, to the extent that it was one of their outlets out there in the Atlantic Ocean, now becoming a tourist paradise. Sierra Leone was famous for a number of minerals and was also nearer to the United Kingdom, and ultimately we know cocoa was a major commodity that was being traded at that particular time. And when you talk about Cadbury's chocolate, you must never forget that it is the chocolate and the cocoa from Ghana that was being used to open up factories such as Cadbury's chocolate. When you go to Zimbabwe, which was also a settler community because of the weather that was there, you'll find a lot of things that was coming from that particular area. The textile industry was big in that area, and of course we know that in present day Zambia, which was then Northern Rhodesia and was administered for some time as Nyasaland, there was copper. And during the Industrial Revolution, copper was an important ingredient and an important mineral in aiding the industries in Europe and specifically in the United Kingdom, which had become a major industrial power. Which then begs the question, how do we assess British colonization? Being indirect as it was, one of the methods that they used was divide and rule. And the divide and rule was creating conflict amongst the different nations, so that when they came to Kenya, they ensured that there was conflict between the Luos and the Kikuyu. They ensured that there was conflict between the Baluhia and the Luos. They ensured that there was conflict between the Maasai and other communities, because divided in that way, you would not join efforts for purposes of removing them from power. They went to Uganda and ensured that they divided the country and ensured that there was conflict between the Baganda and the Wanyoro and the Aluru and the Jopadola and the Acholi, and ensured that this was done. And if they went to countries such as the Gambia, they ensured that there was a conflict amongst the Malinke people. In Nigeria, they ensured that there was a conflict between the Hausa Fulani in the north. There was conflict between the Igbo and the Yoruba, between the Ijo and the Ibibio, and they did this very deliberately. And when they went to Ghana, they created conflict between the Akan people, between the Ewe people, between the Ga. And when they went to Sierra Leone, they ensured that there was the conflict between the Temne and the Mende. This was their modus operandi. And it is instructive, therefore, that when they had created this division and created this animosity amongst the different nations, which they described as tribes, they then pitted them against each other and delayed the struggle for independence. And even when there was a struggle for independence, they ensured that there are those who did not quite want the struggle for independence to continue because they were favored by the British. So their system of governance was as diabolical as it was clever by one half. And it is instructive that even when they were leaving, they ensured that culturally they had created domination. Because as we know, one of the other things that the British ensured they did was to create cultural domination. Cultural domination through institutions such as the British Council. Cultural domination to ensure that the language was propagated. Cultural domination to ensure that their mode of worship was introduced and was allowed to be propagated. And religion was also another thing that they used. They introduced religion, midwifed in their own way through churches such as the Anglican Church. And it must never be lost on us that even as we speak now, the titular head of the Anglican Church is the British king or queen. They now have a king. He is the titular head, and it must never be lost on us that the spiritual head of the Anglican Church is the Archbishop of Canterbury. In other words, it is Christianity as anglicized. And they did not stop there. When they came with the Presbyterian Church, the Presbyterian Church was the arm of the church which emanated from Scotland, and therefore the spirituality, Christianity, was midwifed and given a color that was English. And this was in order to ensure that religion was used as a way of dominance. And it is never lost on me that whether you are in Nairobi, Kenya, or whether you are in Accra, Ghana, you'll always discover that the house of the governor is next to the house of the Archbishop of the Anglican Church. That is the extent to which they ensured that this happened. The British were clever by one half. They dominated us. And when they left, they introduced us into the Commonwealth of Independent Nations. And you know, whenever I hear them saying that they were good colonizers, I'm always reminded of these words of India's Mahatma Gandhi. He told them that despite the best intention of the best of you, you have to humiliate us in order to govern us. We cannot accept to be humiliated. And in many African countries, those who were then in the struggle for independence from the British were always unequivocal as to how they were going to be in the struggle against the British, and they told them in unequivocal terms. In Ghana, we know Kwame Nkrumah led that struggle and told them we don't want to be dominated. We know Siaka Stevens says so in Sierra Leone. We know Dauda Kairaba Jawara said it in the Gambia. In Kenya, Jomo Kenyatta said it. And of course, in Zimbabwe, Robert Gabriel Mugabe said it. And of course, in Malawi, Kamuzu Hastings Banda said it. Kenneth David Kaunda said it. In Somaliland, we never quite remember that in the Horn of Africa, in Hargeisa, the British were also present there. And it is only upon regaining independence that Somaliland became part of Somalia, with the capital moving from Hargeisa to Mogadishu. This, and of course, we can't forget that they were in the Sudan. And we can't forget that they were in Egypt. And we can't forget that it's out of Egypt that we also found one of the greatest Pan-Africanists to ever emerge, Gamal Abdel Nasser. So the British rule, however indirect it was colonization at its worst. It was colonization that still continues today through the institutions such as the Commonwealth. It was colonization that still continues today through collaborations even with militaries. It was collaboration that continues even today. It is never lost on me that in many African countries, when we have an election, even now, our would-be presidents are invited to a debate in Chatham in London. And then they come and we vote for them. And then they continue to do the bidding of the British. They were colonizers par excellence. From Liberty House in Nairobi, Kenya, we are conversing around the continent and about colonization. Goodbye. We see you at another time.